Hello, this is John Baugh again, and I am your guide to CIS 1440. We are on week 10 now. The recording is being uploaded a little later than usual, but still on time. This week we will be going over jQuery DOM scripting, validation, and plugins, which covers Meroc chapter 9 through 11 in the current JavaScript and jQuery edition of the book, and Ducket 7. So you'll notice Ducket 7 is actually over 3 different weeks because it's a pretty big chapter and they pretty much cover everything fundamentally jQuery in those chapters. So we're going to do kind of a bird's eye overview of some of this material, and you can work through the specific examples a little more in detail on your own and make sure you understand them more fully. But chapter 9 to start with is how to use DOM manipulation and traversal methods. So there are some methods that you want to be aware of. You've dealt with several in the past couple chapters already, but this chapter really gives you a whole lot of methods for working with the different attributes and class attributes and things like that. So this right here, these are the methods that are used for working with attributes. You've got attr, name, and then a name value overload version, one that takes a map. That would be a value of multiple attributes specified by name value pairs in the attribute map. And then you've got one that takes a name and a function. So this sets the value of the name attribute to the value returned by the function. So this is really very similar to this one up here, which takes just a value. It's just you specify a function here, and the function returns a value. So that function call is replaced by the value it returns, if it returns a value. So that value will be set into name. So I wouldn't necessarily consider this and this one much different. And then, of course, you've got remove attribute, which completely removes the attribute from a particular element. Here's an example. If you want to, for example, set the value of the source attribute of an image, you can grab the image that has an ID named image, and then you say .attr. You're not getting it because you have two different parameters here. If you were doing a single parameter, it would be the get version. But here you're taking source and you're setting it to book1.jpg. This uses a map right here that sets the values of two attributes. Okay, so this is kind of a nice shorthand way of doing some things rather than making multiple calls to attr. You could do this separately, obviously. You could call attr on source and then attr on alt for the alternate text. However, you can do it all in one fell swoop. So notice there are parentheses here. Okay, that surrounds the argument that's sent to attribute or attr. But then you have curly braces on either side of this, and then you have the name of the attribute colon value, comma, next attribute you want to set, colon, the next value for that attribute, alt. So you could do multiple attributes all at once. This is just an alternate syntax. This right here sets href to a value returned by this function. So given a specific index, this grabs the ID, or it sets the href to the ID here plus a particular index, and then returns that href. So assuming that somewhere in this file you have different IDs for various headings, I would say it's probably maybe slightly similar to the first part of your last programming assignment where you had to set the value of the particular heading to collapse it. So in some ways it's similar to that, except this one they're actually naming the headings with different IDs. And you can also remove attributes from all H2 elements. So this is an example with the within the facts element. So all H2 elements that are inside of an element whose ID is facts, FAQS. Here are methods for working specifically with class attributes. You have has class, add class, and two versions of that, remove class, and then also toggle class. And here are attributes for, or versions examples of working with the different versions of the attribute has the class attributes such as has class, add class, and remove class. So right here you grab the thing with the fax ID. You call has class. If it has closed, you do something. Otherwise, grab add a class to all the HT2 descendants of the fax element. So this would be an example of doing that. Call add class minus. So that will take all of the H2 descendant elements from the class, any kind of element with the ID fax, and it will add the class minus to them. And then you can go back and remove minus. So this is some of this is fairly familiar. These are methods for DOM replacement. Now, when dealing with the document object model, we have to know that the actual file that you get from HTML, when a browser receives that file, it builds a document object model in memory. So we have to know that the HTML is a file, so it gets sent. It's ultimately on a drive somewhere, and then when you request it, it's sent over the network, and then received as a file. But then the browser has to read it into memory, and when the browser reads it into memory, or what we call main memory, or RAM, random access memory, it has to convert it into some sort of model that it can understand. So what it converts it in memory is called the document object model. It's like a tree. We've seen it before, several diagrams throughout the book. And the Duckett book actually has a lot of very good diagrams for the document object model. But that's how the browser sees it in memory. Now, when you manipulate the DOM, you actually change the DOM elements and values within the elements. It doesn't change the HTML itself. It changes the DOM. So it actually takes this tree that has all these elements in it, and it changes different values throughout the tree and even removes some. So these are some of the ones that you have available to you. So val is for getting the value of a selected control on a form and setting that value with these two. Text gets the combined text contents of all selected elements, including their descendants. If you want to set the contents of each selected element to a specified text, or using the function, you set the contents of whatever the text is returned by this function. Then you have HTML that actually can modify the HTML itself in the DOM. So you've got all this stuff to choose from. So here are just some examples. If you have an aside element and you want to display all of the HTML just in that element, you can call alert on that. So this will actually just show it. So that's showing you that you can get it. Okay, you can get it just so you can see it if you want to. You've got here where it says put an H2 element into an aside element. And this one, replace all elements that have a class named old. So you get anything with .old. So that means anything with the class old. We replace with an H2 element. Replace all elements that have a class replace all elements that have an H2 with old. Okay, replace all old with the H2. Sorry, this does essentially the same thing. So replace the selected element with the specified content. And then this one replaces each target element with the selected elements. Okay, so replace anything with old with that. Okay, so these essentially are very similar. So they do essentially the same thing, but two different ways to do it. These are methods for DOM insertion and cloning. These become interesting and useful when you need to clone a specific aspect of the DOM or insert or append or prepend various data and content to different portions of an element. So prepend puts them at the start of the element, append puts it to the end of the element. Before we'll insert the specified content before each selected element. Now notice that append, as a difference here, append will insert specified content to the end of each selected element. Okay, and then append inserts to, oh, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The prepend will put it to the start of each element. The append will put it to the end of each element. And then before inserts the specified content before. Okay, so before actually goes before whatever element you're talking you're calling the method on. Prepend, you might think, well, that sounds the same as prepend because they're both putting them at the start. Well, prepend will actually insert it into the beginning. So you might notice that this does have a different effect in certain circumstances. And there's some examples there. There are various methods for DOM wrapping and removal. Wrapping takes elements that exist in the DOM, and it will wrap them with specified elements. So whatever selected element calls this, you say, wrap that selected element around or wrap this specified element right here around whatever selected element it is. So for example, we have something like this. This says to wrap all anchor tags, anything that has the A tag in it, you wrap it with H2 elements. So that means you put an H2 around the A tags anywhere in the code. Okay, they've got the table of content example, which we'll just go through briefly. We notice that here's the jQuery plan for this table of contents. The idea behind the table of contents is that you'll have some HTML. You'll have different sections here talking about stuff, and then you have back to top, and then you have this table of contents right here. So table of contents, and that's the user interface. So when you click on one of these, it takes you to the appropriate section. Each of these are inner anchor tags. So it looks something like this. So you've got, for example, modular book organization, whenever possible, da-da-da. So you also have the top here, and then you've got the aside. The aside is actually the table of contents that we see right here. This is the aside contents. Inside the aside, you have the various headings listed. Heading 1, heading 2. So heading 1 ID, heading 2 ID, and then it says the rest, so there's more. Okay, now here's the plan for the jQuery table of contents application. You've got you have the ability to add the H2 element for the table of contents heading to the aside, wrap the text of the H2 elements with an anchor, add correct IDs to the anchors, clone the anchor elements in the article and insert them after the H2 elements in the aside, remove the ID attributes from the A elements in the aside, and then add the correct href attributes to the A elements in the aside so that when you click on them, they will go to the appropriate location. Also, wrap anchor element with top, one of them, with top as its ID around the text in the H1 so you can go back to the top, and insert anchor elements that go to the H1 element at the end of each topic. Okay, so we'll take a look at this application in just a second. So you've got the aside, you're appending, so they're following basically an instruction at each point, so you should be able to go through these and clearly see what it's doing. So if we go in here, table of contents, this is the original one. So I'm going to run this guy. So if you click on any of these, you'll notice that I can click on these and it'll take me somewhere to where that item is. Now obviously there's a limitation unless I was zoomed in very far. It won't go below the page. But notice that all of these have a back to top on them, and each of these will actually take me back to the very top of the document. So this is actually pretty cool. So to continue on this and maybe enhance the table of contents application, they've got methods for working with styles. So instead of just working with just the HTML elements, you have also the ability to work with the cascading style sheets for each of these. So you've got CSS with a name that gets the value of a particular named property. Name comma value, that sets it. So a lot of these should look very familiar to you because you're used to using ones that if they take one parameter, you're pretty sure that it probably, in many cases, it will get the item. A map would be a setter, but because the map, you don't specify the name as a parameter, you specify it inside of the map itself. Remember we saw the curly braces and then the values, in quotes like alt colon then the value in an image, for example. So here's style examples. If we want to get all H2 elements and we want to set them to blue, you say .css, then you take the name of the property that you want to set. That's the color property, right? Color property, comma, value you want to set it to. So blue. You could also use, of course, the hexadecimal values as well, if you're familiar with using those. Use a map to set two CSS properties for all H2 elements. So this will take all H2 elements and then set the color and the font size. So this one takes the map. This is our map friend. Get the height of an article element. So this one will help us get the height of a particular article, which you may need, to put it in the right location or to, accommodate something else for it, maybe putting some images around it. But then when it expands, you don't want to have to redo the page. Then you have to do it dynamically. So let's say we have, like, say, some sort of decoration at the top of the article and then one at the bottom, and you want it to grow automatically if anything gets added to the article. So this would be one way to help with that. Here's methods for positioning. So when we're working with styles, we're working with how things look, and then the positioning has to do with how does stuff get on the page. So right here you've got the positioning element. So offset, that gets the coordinates of the first selected elements and returns them in an object with top and left properties. Now you might think, well, what kind of object? Well, it's a generic object, essentially in JavaScript. And the same thing here, when you set it, you have to pass it an object with top and left properties. JavaScript works very differently from a lot of other languages. With JavaScript, you can create a generic object, like here, you can just say var side coordinates equals new object, and that just means it's some sort of object, and then you just, start magically adding data or methods to it. So I say dot top, and now magically there's a top that lives inside that particular object. That equals 200, then a left. So as long as there's a top and a left to it, that you can pass it to these methods. So right here we create the object, get the top and the left, and then they get the aside and set the offset to the aside coordinates that we specified. So that's pretty useful. Here is the table of contents application that moves to a particular topic. So the critical CSS, you have to make sure you have body position set to relative and asides set to absolute. The jQuery event handler that's been added for this is you have the aside for A. When it's clicked, anything in the aside, derive the ID of the selected H2 element from the A tag. So they obtain the href of the A tag that was clicked. That's this. Okay, so this.attr href. So this A is the one that was clicked. Href attribute, and then it says to change for that particular A, we're changing the style to blue with a larger font size. Then move the aside so it is next to the selected heading. So this table of contents is going to work a little bit different than what we saw before. So if I do the table of contents enhanced right here, the HTML content's essentially the same, but when I click this, if I click any of these, you'll notice that now the table of contents actually moves down the page. So it actually goes with you. You don't have to scroll up to go. You don't have to scroll up to move with it. And notice it's turning the H2 to blue, right? As you visit different links, right? Okay. So if I refresh it, I click this, it automatically turns that to blue. One thing you could do if you go to, say, top-down chapter design, you could unblue the one that you were on. Okay, so you could return that to black if you wanted to. That's another possibility. So these are DOM tree traversal methods. The DOM, these are methods that help you get any of the elements in the document object model. So we've seen some. We know about sibling and getting the sibling. But these are to get parents and children, parents until a particular selector, and there's all kinds of different options we have here. So I'd say take a look at those. For example, if we want to get the previous paragraph sibling of an element, you could say last heading element, anything with that ID, get the previous paragraph. So the paragraph that is before this last heading. Some of you might have found that the .prev was very helpful for your assignment. These are filtering methods. These are used for reducing or removing specific elements. So for example, you've got the filter on a particular selector that reduces the set of selected elements to those that match the selector. Not means get all the elements. If you call something on it and you get a bunch of elements, it says anything but the selector specified here. So this might be a better example, or better if you saw an example. So for example, change a property for H2 elements in the best class. So this says get all H2 elements, and then when you call dot filter, get only those that have the best class, then set the cascading style sheet color property to red. If you want to change the property for all paragraph elements except the one in the first class, so you'll say get all paragraph elements but not the one with the first class, set the CSS text indent to 1.5 ems. So this is pretty useful. You can do a lot to you can make these fairly sophisticated if you combine them. If you do some combinations and use them appropriately, you'll see that it's actually pretty exciting and interesting. So as a note, they do a slideshow application just to show you here. Got kind of an interesting application. So this right here. Notice that the books will fade out and then fade back in, right? This is done with jQuery. Okay, so this is done with jQuery and CSS. There's no magic here, no animated GIF, nothing special like that. It's doing fading. It's doing all kinds of exciting things to make a slideshow. And then they have another example which I think they slightly improved. It's a little bit different. It may just be the code's different slightly. Yeah, I think it does essentially the same thing, but it's a different way to do it. So that's pretty much what you have for this chapter. Let me see if there's a... Yeah, they showed you two different ways to do it. And then there's some exercises at the end if you want to do some modifications and get a little more experience. So they do have extras at the end. I notice I've had a couple people email me and say that they were struggling and didn't feel that the exercises were very, were helping them, or that there wasn't enough information in the book to do the exercises. And I will assure you that there is. There is enough. They were not giving you any information that you don't have available to you in the in that particular chapter, or at least previous chapters. So when you modify or create these different exercises, if you're practicing, then I would say, just make sure that you carefully look at the phrasing and exactly how they say to do the different exercises, because the exercises, unlike the particular extras that I give you, these exercises often will give you more information. For example, exercise 9.1 for modifying the table of contents application. You take it and it tells you pretty much step by step, and it says exactly what you need to change. So you have to be careful, make sure you understand the terminology. If there's a specific word, if they say something like the third block of code in the ready event handler adds IDs to an anchor elements, you need to make sure where they're talking about, what they're talking about. If you don't, then you need to review terminology like what is the ready event handler, what is a block of code, what is an anchor element. So just make sure you're comfortable with all those. All right, so next we have Chapter 10. Chapter 10 focuses primarily on forms and data validation. So how to work with forms and data validation. And again, a lot of this stuff is not going to make tons of sense until you really just dig in and actually, check it out. So judy@murdoch.com, first name Judy. I'm pretty sure I've actually emailed Judy at Murdoch, and I believe she's actually one of the reps there, but that may be a fake email address. I may be thinking of someone else. So we've got the HTML for the form here. and notice that there's a URL that's sent when the form is submitted. This uses the get method, so that means it uses the query strings. So after the question mark, there's a query string here. Okay, so it's separated by ampersands. You've got the email address set to Judy at Muroc. Now this %40 is because the @ symbol is not allowed in a URL, so this is a special key to indicate that that's supposed to be translated into an @ symbol. And first name Judy, there's nothing special there. So attributes of the form element, you've got the name, action, and method. The name, you should be familiar with pretty much all of these if you've taken the 1400 class, or especially the 1420. You should be very thoroughly familiar with these. You should be, at least by the end of the chapter, if not before, familiar with terms such as form, control, field, submit button, reset button, and data validation. And also be familiar with email, URL, tell, number, range, date, and time. These are HTML5 controls for input data. So these are specifically HTML5 controls that are made for these specific types. And then these are the primary HTML5 attributes for working with forms. So you've got autofocus, placeholder, required, title, and pattern. And these right here are called CSS3, or Cascading Style Sheets 3, pseudo classes for required, valid, and invalid fields. So you might be familiar with some pseudo classes dealing with hyperlinks, anchor tags when it's selected, clicked, unselected, things like that. It'll change different colors. Those are pseudo classes. They're not considered full-fledged classes in CSS. So they've got a colon in front of them, notice. You do need to understand JavaScript. Don't just deal with jQuery and not really understand much of the JavaScript. Really, you have to know JavaScript, at least some of it, to understand jQuery. But it's very important that JavaScript is one of your tools as a front-end developer. So you've got HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and jQuery. As a front-end developer, in other words, what you would call a web designer, primarily. Even if you're in a web development track, it's very good to understand how the front end works. So if you have the full range, you know how to design the front end and the back end, then you'll be a very, very effective web developer. But you should understand the need for JavaScript for data validation and also understand jQuery as well. These are jQuery selectors for form controls. You've got input, which is for all form elements that are input based. You've got text, that's all text boxes, such as input elements with a type equal to text, radios, input elements with type equal to radio, etc. Right? So etc. So these are all different types of controls that are on the form. So when I say controls, you should be thinking things like buttons and images and text boxes. It's the stuff that makes up a graphical user interface. So the jQuery methods for setting, getting, and trimming the values that you get back, you're ultimately going to get text back, which is a string. So you can get the value, you can set values, you can also trim, which means that removes the white space from the beginning and end of a particular value that you get back. If you have a numeric entry in a text box, then you can get the value, and then you can call parse int on it, and then that converts it to an integer so it can be used as an actual integer. If you want to trim the value of an entry and put it back in the same text box, this is how you would do it. You would first get the entry that the person entered. Okay, so you have first name as the element you're getting, something with an ID first name, and then it has a value. Then you call trim on it. Okay, you call cascaded method calls here. You call the trim method so that you can remove any white space from the beginning or end, and then you set it. So you call the val method for setting. This one takes a parameter, notice, and this one doesn't, because this is for getting. This one was for setting. This is for radio buttons. This gets the value of the checked radio button in a group. Okay, so you use the pseudo pseudo class or the selector right here that says the checked thing in the input control whose name is contacted by, and then you get the value. So you say dot value. So that's pretty useful because you might want to know which one is selected, and that could be useful for you. How to get an array of selected options from a list. So you create the array and make sure it's created as an array. This is our shorthand for creating an array here. And then you say get all the select list and then the selected options from that list. So this list could have multiple selections in it. So this gives you an array of the selections. Could be one element, could be 20. It just depends on how many items they've selected. These are jQuery event methods for forms. You've got focus, blur, change, select, and submit. Okay, so this handler disables or enables radio buttons when a checkbox is checked or unchecked. So this is very, very useful. So the contact me checkbox, if it is changed, in other words, if the checkbox is either, if it's unchecked if it's checked, or if it's checked when it's unchecked, that means if it changes state, it calls this function. Well, what does this function do? Well, if it is checked, it sets the radio button, all radio buttons, sets the disabled attribute to false. So if it's checked, that means it enables or allows the radio buttons to be selected. If the checkbox is unchecked, meaning it doesn't have the checked attribute, meaning it's unchecked, then what happens here is it sets disabled to true. So that means if it's unchecked, you cannot work with the radio buttons. Right, so there's a lot of dynamic stuff you can do with jQuery. All right, so form for validation application. If we go to chapter 10's member form validation, let's see if this may or may not be what we want here. Okay, this is the full thing. You'll see the ultimate thing. If I click submit now, you'll notice that it tells me different fields are required. It will take in various values. So this is a pretty professional looking form here. You could change the colors, obviously, and change some of the styles. You could change the border to something more interesting. You could use the height attribute to get this and then put images all around it, or do whatever you want, really. I mean, there's all kinds of cool stuff, and I think jQuery is going to make the sky the limit, really. This shows you how to work with the different elements. We won't go through the thing ad nauseum, but notice that there's actually more than one. There's more than one JavaScript file here. Okay, this right here, I wouldn't worry about it too much. This one you actually download. This is one that's used later. This is a plugin. Okay, so this is a validation plugin that someone else wrote. So this is the minimum version. It's not very easily human readable because they've removed all the spaces. It makes it as small as possible, basically. So there is a non-minimum version if you want to read through the code better. But notice that you could, if you spent a long time, probably figure out what's going on here. But this is the minimized version. Okay, so they put it under the GPL GNU license, so it's free. You've got Jorn Zaferer. He's the one that actually produces plugins. So you don't have to write this. This is something you download from jQuery's website. This is just showing you that there are plugins that you can use for data validation, for example. Okay, so that's pretty much it. They spend the rest of the time looking for through validation. They tell you how to make your own. But since there are a lot of things that are already set in some of the plugins, then they're telling you, hey, why not just use the plugin? So, all right, so that's chapter 10. Chapter 10 is very good for learning the basics of how to work with forms more thoroughly, and also how to determine if the user has entered valid data or not. And then you have chapter 11. So this is the final chapter for this section. Again, we're kind of doing a bird's eye view, so this will definitely take work on your part as well. This is validation plugins. Okay, so they're talking about, well, how do we use validation plugins? But there's other useful plugins as well. So this just shows you websites for finding jQuery plugins. So anyone can write a jQuery plugin. In fact, in the book, they tell you how to create a plugin near the end, but they're telling you if you can already find what you want and it's the right license, okay, it's free, or if you pay a company or someone pays you to create plugins, that's always possible. Um, just notice that there are tons of different places to look for jQuery plugins. You've got the plugin repository at jQuery. You've got a website called jQuery Plugins even. Google Code, GitHub, and SourceForge are good locations to look at it. Here are plugins for displaying images. You've got Lightbox, Fancybox, Thickbox, Colorbox, and Shadowbox .js. They each have their own websites here. These are various plugins for displaying images. You got plugins for slideshows, carousels, and galleries. So this is just tons of different stuff that you have available to you. You've got masonry, text layout, UI layout, tons and tons and tons of things for forms, for interface design, jQuery UI. We haven't covered that yet. We'll talk more about that next time. It's technically a set of plugins. jQuery Mobile and JQ Touch as well. What are the general steps for using a plugin? Now, this isn't about creating a plugin. This is about how do we use a plugin. Well, you study the documentation for the plugin, so I hate to break it to you, even after you're out of school, you're going to have to read a lot. So if you are going into any area of computer science, web design is no different. So software development and web design, it's what we call a field of lifelong learning. Okay, this isn't like maybe basket weaving where the techniques don't change that frequently. This is something, a very dynamic field you've chosen, so you're going to have to constantly learn, and learning makes you more valuable in the industry. So study the documentation for the plugin. Any new plugin, don't just, I know most people probably sit around and get angry at their new video games that they buy, but eventually learn how to play them. Some people, rarely, even myself, occasionally, I will sit down and actually read some of the documentation for a game or for something else that I'm going to use. It usually does help you, and you might figure out some things that'll make using it a lot easier, whereas you might have a counterpart that's just trying to dive in, and it might give them a headache. So definitely work with the plugin. You can play around with it and see if you can figure it out, or look at tutorials and examples. But the documentation is quite useful. At least be familiar with how to get answers if you need them. Get the URLs for the plugin files if they're available via a content distribution network, content delivery network, or download the files and save them in a folder of your website. So you can reference the URLs in some cases, but downloading them and saving them, although that will actually be probably better, because if the URLs, the CDN goes down or some other website goes down, there might be a problem. And your code won't work anymore if it's referencing another site. In the head element of the HTML, you code the links for any CSS files that are required and any script elements for the JavaScript that's required. Code the HTML and CSS in the page that's appropriate for that particular plugin, and then write the jQuery code that uses the methods and options of the plugin. Two cautions with plugins: make sure that you include a script element for jQuery, and make sure that script is at the script element for the plugin comes after it. Because the way the script elements work is that it includes the code for the script in the HTML as needed. So in order for the plugin to work, it has to have jQuery included before it, so it has access to jQuery. Some plugins won't work with the latest version of jQuery, so if you have any problems with the plugin, check its documentation to see which version of jQuery it requires. So some plugins are using some of the deprecated or older methods that come from earlier versions of jQuery, but with the newer versions of jQuery, these plugins may not work. So you've got to make sure that you have access to the older version of jQuery, or just not use those particular plugins. So script elements for the jQuery library, the BX slider as an example. Notice that you include the jQuery first. Either you download it and include it in your website, or you go to the jQuery code base in the CDN, and then you put the script for the plugin. Okay, let's say you write a plugin based on another plugin. You have to have that plugin before yours. So make sure you do that. This is the slider, for example. You set the ID for the BX slider. If you set it to slider and then put images in it, that will allow you to use it as a slider. Then you code the BX slider for the particular slider. You tell it what to do. This is a plugin option for display slide quantity and move slide quantity. These are all different slider options. So I think, yeah, BX slider is right here. So right here, it's somewhat similar to what we had before. This uses the plugin though, so just be aware that this is available. It's actually really cool, really useful. You can make these larger, obviously, but so just be aware of that. There are other options as well that they go through throughout this chapter. Lightbox. So instead of just the carousel, you can use Lightbox also. They're talking about different versions. So this is the cycle plugin. Yeah, cycle. And they might each work differently. Okay, so this one does it automatically. You're not clicking anything. So notice it's just every couple seconds it slides it. So just be aware that that is the cycle plugin. Okay. JLayout plugin to create two columns. So this makes things look really interesting. I'm not sure if they got the layout one. Did they do layout? JLayout. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so here's JLayout. So this is just a really nice and compact way to get stuff to move on various sides and to help with the formatting. So not everything's dynamic, or at least looks dynamic. It's not all moving all the time, animated. But there's tons of different things that you can deal with. Just be aware that you can actually create your own plugin. You have the structure of a plugin. You have a function, and then you have to pass it $, and then say $. That actually passes jQuery to it, and then you say the jQuery fn whatever the method name is. You're declaring a new function and adding this to jQuery so it's available. Notice we're passing jQuery down here. That passes the library. So this is how you go through and actually create your own plugin. The details are fairly extensive, and you have to really, really get your feet wet. But really, it's highly recommended that you check to see, is there a plugin that satisfies what I need right now, or do I have to create my own? But sometimes it is good to create your own. So this is a simple selection plugin. jQuery for the plugin is a file name, say jQuery.selection.js. So this is the one they created here. And then they tell you how to use it. So selection is right here. The text for the selection is what is jQuery. Okay, so it goes through here and just shows you that you have different things you can do with this. So there's all kinds of really exciting things that you can do with jQuery and some of the plugins. The plugins are basically the things that people have come up with sometimes, or the developers in jQuery have come up with, who they say, well, jQuery doesn't directly do this for me, and I'm doing quote unquote, or I'm doing this ... all the time. So why don't we just make a plugin for it? So if it's used across multiple websites, making a plugin often does make sense. And there's also naming conventions for plugins. jQuery whatever the plugin name is .js. That's the name of the plugin usually. Okay, API standards, highlighted menus. I think this one. Yep. Yeah, jQuery highlight. See, right? So you can obviously adjust the colors, and as you hover over these, it causes the different colors to change. But they decided they'd make a plugin for it, so they show you how the plugin, a little bit about how the plugin works. So it's not really that much code, really, to be honest. All this underlining is because these, many of these should actually, or this one, well, that one does, but I think that one should have like a semicolon after it. But that would probably take care of the whole thing. Let's see if that works. Yeah, okay, there we go. Missing a semicolon right there. It's technically interpreted by the browser appropriately, but different Aptana Studio is very, very picky about jQuery or JavaScript syntax. So just be aware of all these different plugins. Try to play around with them a little bit. Maybe your next assignment will involve, or one of your assignments might involve dealing with a plugin. So I would say, at least be familiar with what's available here. Maybe go through a couple of the examples. Make sure you understand the code. Now, the actual code of the plugins, if they're written by someone else, you don't have to necessarily dig through them and understand every little detail of them, but know how to use them. Okay, at least be familiar with how to use them. All right, so that's pretty much it this week. I know that was a quick overview, but a lot of this is more facilitated than it is fully instructed. So I want you to go back through the chapters, make sure you can at least do the basic exercise after following the examples in the book, and you should be quite ready to do some of this on your own as well. All right, if you have any questions, please email me at jpbaugh@oaklandcc.edu. Thanks, and have a great week.